Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today, we're going to be talking about a big one.
Yeah.
This is the Supreme Court's ruling from this year on the West Bengal teacher recruitment scam.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and I was thinking, a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with it, at least, in passing.
Sure.
But this is one of those cases where it's so complex
It really is.
that I think even folks who've been following it could use a little help really getting into the weeds. So that's our goal today, right?
Absolutely.
Figure out how the Supreme Court decided that it was okay to basically scrap this whole huge selection process
Yeah.
because of all the, alleged fraud.
Right. And how do they balance
And
it?
then the other thing that's really interesting to me is this whole question of like, okay, so you've got all these people whose appointments are getting thrown out, but presumably at least some of them, got their jobs fair and square.
Yeah.
So how do you sort that out? How do you protect those folks while also saying, look, this whole thing was so messed up, we got to start over?
It's a tough one for sure.
So do this right. We're going to be looking at the Supreme Court's actual judgment. This is in civil appeal arising out of SLP's, no. 9-586 of 2024.
Okay.
Big mouthful there, but we'll put a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to follow along. Now, I know episode 6 of Legal Snippet Law Simplified also did a really good breakdown of this case.
They did a fantastic job, yeah.
So we'll be touching on some of the key points they raised as well. But, here at the Deep Dive, we really like to get our hands dirty with the original source material.
For sure.
So are you ready to get started?
I am ready. Let's do it.
All right, let's set the stage here. What was the situation that sparked this whole controversy?
Well, you got to go back to 2016. That's when the West Bengal Central School Service Commission, or WBSSC for short,
Right.
they were in charge of this massive recruitment drive to fill tons of teaching and non-teaching positions in, state-run schools.
And when you say tons, I mean, we're talking
Oh, yeah.
big numbers here.
Huge numbers.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea,
Yeah.
for assistant teacher roles alone,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about like almost 13,000 positions for classes Ed X and X.
Wow.
Another like nearly 6,000 for classes Eg and 12.
Okay, so already a massive undertaking.
And that's not all. On top of that, there were also over 2,000 Group C non-teaching jobs and almost 4,000 Group D positions up for grabs.
So this is like a logistical
Oh, yeah.
nightmare.
Absolutely. A massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And to handle it all, they brought in this private company,
Okay.
this NISA Communications PVT Ltd,
It's nice.
to deal with all those, OMR sheets.
Right, those answer sheets that get scanned.
Exactly.
Okay, so big recruitment, lots of moving parts. When do things start to go sideways?
Well, pretty much as soon as the results start trickling out,
Oh.
late 2017 into 2018, the Calcutta High Court starts getting flooded with complaints and, formal legal challenges.
Those are the writ petitions, right?
Exactly, writ petitions.
Okay.
People coming to the court basically saying, hold on, something's fishy here.
And what were they complaining about specifically?
Oh, all sorts of things.
Okay.
Some folks claimed they weren't given, like the age relaxation they were entitled to. Others said certain counseling lists were never published. And then you had some really serious allegations of what they call rank jumping.
Rank jumping.
Yeah, basically people claiming that candidates who scored lower somehow got appointed over those who did better on the exams.
That does sound suspicious.
Yeah, and there were claims that waiting lists were just ignored,
Yeah.
that the selection process was totally arbitrary, like pick and choose,
Okay.
and even that some of the folks who got jobs didn't actually meet the basic qualifications.
So from the get-go, there were a lot of red flags.
Oh, yeah.
So what did the WBSSC say about all this?
Interestingly enough, they actually admitted that some stuff had gone wrong.
Really?
Yeah, as more and more of these petitions came in, they submitted statements to the court acknowledging that there had been, irregularities and mistakes.
Okay, but were they specific about what those mistakes were?
Well, that's the thing. They admitted to some instances of rank jumping and cases where people got appointment letters, even though their names weren't on the list. But when the court pushed for details, like how many illegal appointments were there, who exactly was involved, the WBSSC claimed they couldn't actually verify the full extent of the problem.
So basically, yeah, we messed up, but we don't really know how badly.
Pretty much.
That's not exactly reassuring, is it?
Not at all.
So what happened next? Did the court just take their word for it?
Nope, they weren't buying it. The Calcutta High Court decided they need to get to the bottom of this. So they set up a special committee headed by a retired judge, Justice Ranjit Kumar Bag. This committee had a very specific task: to go through and meticulously verify the appointments of all the non-teaching staff.
That's the Group C and Group D positions.
You got it.
Okay, and what did they find?
Well, let's just say their findings were pretty damning. They basically concluded that the WBSSC had messed with the ranking of candidates.
After the panel had already been finalized.
Exactly, after it was finalized, but before it was put up on their website.
That sounds deliberate.
And get this, they also questioned whether the committee that was supposed to oversee the whole recruitment process even had the proper legal authority.
Wow.
And to top it all off, the BAG committee named several high-ranking WBSSC officials, saying they were prima facie liable.
That means based on the evidence they'd seen, there was a good reason to believe these folks were responsible.
Exactly. For serious neglect of duty. They even recommended that the police file FIRs. Those are formal criminal complaints.
Right.
Against some of these individuals.
I mean, what, specifically?
Oh, serious stuff like forgery and cheating under the Indian Penal Code.
So at this point, it's becoming pretty clear that this is more than just a few isolated mistakes.
Way more.
Now, I know the OMR sheets, those answer sheets, became a major point of contention as well.
Oh, huge.
Can you walk us through what happened there?
So when the court asked the WBSSC to produce the original OMR sheets, as evidence,
They just didn't have them.
Initially, they handed over scanned copies. But then they claimed they didn't actually have those copies themselves.
What?
Yeah, they said they got them from Mrs. Nisa, the company that processed them.
So they're basically saying, we outsource a crucial part of the process, and we didn't keep any backup records.
Essentially.
That's unbelievable.
Right. And then they tried to justify destroying the physical OMR sheets by pointing to this rule, Rule 21 of the recruitment rules for teaching staff, which said they could get rid of them after a year.
But there's a catch there, right?
Oh, yeah, big catch. That rule only applied to the teaching positions.
Not the non-teaching rules.
Exactly.
But the WBSSC admitted they destroyed the OMR sheets for all the jobs.
All of them.
Even though there was no rule that let them do that for Group C and D positions.
They did.
So they destroyed potential evidence, and for a huge chunk of these jobs, they didn't even have a legal basis for doing so.
It's a mess.
It really is. So at this point, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, gets brought in, right, because it's clear this is a really big deal.
Oh, yeah.
So the High Court tells the CBI, look, you guys got to investigate this whole thing, top to bottom, all the alleged illegalities, every single category of job.
Thorough investigation.
And that investigation uncovered even more.
Oh, it did.
Especially when it came to those OMR sheets and the data.
Right.
So what did the CBI find?
So the CBI got their hands on 3 hard drives
Okay.
from a former employee of Miss Nisa. And these hard drives had a ton of data on them about how those OMR sheets were processed.
All right, so what did they do with that?
Well, they got to work. They compared that data with what was on the WBSSC's servers, the official records.
Yeah.
And they found mismatches.
Mismatches. What kind of mismatches?
So in a bunch of cases, the marks on the WBSSC server had been changed.
Change how?
The written marks had been increased to make candidates eligible.
So people who wouldn't have qualified based on their actual scores suddenly become eligible.
Exactly.
And how widespread was this?
Oh, it was all over the place. They found this manipulation in all 4 categories.
Glasses, NIX and X, XI and 12, Group C and Group D.
All of them.
So we're not talking about a few bad apples here. This is systematic.
Completely systematic.
So the CBI report lays out all these discrepancies.
It does.
And they identify a huge number of cases where marks were messed with.
Thousands of cases.
Okay, break it down for me. How many in each category?
So for Class IX and X teachers, 952 cases. Class XM and 12, 907. Group C staff, a whopping 3,481.
Wow.
And Group D, 2,823.
So we're talking about over 7,000 instances of potential mark manipulation.
At least.
And did the CBI find anything else that pointed to a coordinated effort to rig the system?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They found emails between WBSSC officials and Mrs. Nisa.
Okay.
And even internal Nisa communications. And these emails had lists of candidates whose OMR scores had been inflated.
On the WBSSC server?
Yep, the official records.
So this wasn't just some random glitch. Someone was actively changing the data.
It's looking that way.
And did the investigation turn up anything else that casts doubt on the WBSSC's actions?
Oh, yeah, remember those scanned copies of the OMR sheets?
The ones the WBSSC said they got from Mrs. Nisa.
Exactly. Well, the CBI found inconsistencies in the WBSSC's statements about those copies.
So they couldn't even keep their story straight.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got thousands of potentially fraudulent appointments, clear evidence of manipulated marks, original documents destroyed, and the WBSSC can't even give a consistent account of what happened.
It's a pretty bad look.
It really is. And this leads us to a big legal question. When can a court decide to throw out a whole selection process? Not just disqualify a few people, but scrap the entire thing because of fraud.
Right. That's the key question here.
So how did the Supreme Court approach this issue?
Well, they looked at a lot of their own past rulings.
Precedents.
Exactly. Precedents.
So basically, looking at how they've handled similar situations in the past to guide their decision in this case. Now, they didn't go into a ton of detail about the specifics of those past cases, but the principles behind those rulings are really important.
Absolutely.
So what are those key principles that let the Supreme Court annul a whole selection process?
Okay, so the big one is, if the investigation shows that there were systematic irregularities or fraud, problems that go to the heart of the process.
So not just isolated incidents.
Right, not just a few bad apples. If the whole thing is compromised, then the court can say, nope, got to toss this whole thing out.
Okay, so that's the principle.
But there's a catch.
There's always a catch, isn't there?
Well, the courts generally try to protect the innocent. So if it's possible to separate out the people who got selected fairly from those who benefited from the fraud.
That's a preferred option.
Yeah, ideally you want to punish the wrongdoers, but not harm the folks who did everything right.
That makes sense.
So the court has to figure out, are the problems so widespread and systematic that the whole process is tainted?
Or can we salvage some of it? So how do they determine that? What's the threshold for saying, okay, this is too messed up, we got to start over?
Well, the Supreme Court's been very clear on this. It's not enough to just suspect wrongdoing. You need solid evidence from a fair investigation.
So gut feelings aren't going to cut it?
Nope, got to have proof.
And what kind of proof are we talking about? Do they need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that every single appointment was fraudulent?
Not necessarily for every single case. What they need to show is what they call a reasonable certainty of systemic malaise.
Reasonable certainty of systemic malaise, that's a mouthful.
It is.
What does that actually mean?
Basically, it means there has to be a high probability that the entire process was tainted.
So not just a possibility, but a strong likelihood.
Exactly.
And this is where the CBI investigation becomes super important.
Partial.
Because they provided that evidence.
They did. A mountain of evidence.
Showing that the problems were systemic, not isolated. Okay, so the court's got to balance protecting the innocent with ensuring the integrity of the process. And sometimes those two goals are in conflict.
They can be, yeah.
So what did the Supreme Court say about that?
Well, they acknowledge that sometimes. Upholding the purity of the selection process and maintaining public trust might mean causing inconvenience or disappointment to candidates who were selected fairly.
So basically saying, look, we know this sucks for the innocent folks, but sometimes the system has to be protected even if it means some good people get caught in the crossfire.
That's the gist of it.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, but I can see the logic there.
Right. If you don't protect the integrity of the process, then the whole system loses credibility.
And nobody trusts it anymore.
Exactly.
Now, what about the argument that everyone whose appointment is being canceled deserves their own individual hearing?
Did the Supreme Court address that?
Yeah, they did.
What did they say?
They said that, yeah, in principle, everyone deserves a chance to defend themselves.
That's the idea of natural justice.
Everyone gets a fair hearing.
But they also said that when you're talking about massive fraud, like in this case, where the whole process is tainted, individual hearings might not be practical or necessary.
It would be a logistical nightmare.
Imagine trying to hold thousands of individual hearings. It would be chaos.
It would take forever.
And probably wouldn't even be effective.
Right. The focus shifts from individual guilt to the overall failure of the system.
So basically, when the system itself is broken, you can't just try to fix it by looking at each case in isolation.
You got to address the root cause.
Okay, so that's the legal framework. How did the Supreme Court apply those principles to the specifics of the West Bengal case?
Well, they went through all the evidence, all those irregularities that had been uncovered.
And there were a lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
Remind us of some of the big ones.
Okay, so there was the tender process for appointing Miss Nisa.
The OMR processing company?
Yeah, that whole process was flawed. Then they subcontracted the work without authorization.
It wasn't allowed. And then there was the destruction of the OMR sheets.
Without any proper backup.
Which, as we discussed, was particularly problematic.
Very.
Then there's the fact that they appointed more people than there were vacancies.
Across all the categories.
So they're overfilling positions?
Yep.
They even appointed people who weren't even on the selection panels.
Totally bypassing the system.
And get this, appointments based on blank OMR sheets?
Like, how does that even happen?
I have no idea.
Then there were appointments made after the panels had expired.
So they're just making stuff up as they go along?
Pretty much.
And of course, we can't forget the rank jumping.
Which was widespread.
They didn't publish the merit lists with the actual scores.
So nobody could verify anything.
They held counseling sessions after the deadline.
Adding to the chaos.
It was basically impossible to figure out who actually got selected fairly.
Right, and on top of all that, they tried to create extra positions.
To accommodate the people who shouldn't have been appointed in the first place.
Exactly, trying to cover their tracks.
Yeah. And all of this while basically ignoring the established recruitment rules.
Total disregard for the rules.
So it's not just one or two issues, it's a whole pattern of wrongdoing.
A systemic failure.
The Supreme Court called it a vitiated and tainted beyond resolution process.
Strong words.
And they were particularly concerned about the destruction of those OMR sheets.
Especially for the non-teaching jobs.
Where they had no right to destroy them.
Right, and the fact that there were no backups.
Made it impossible to verify the fairness of the evaluations.
And to separate the innocent from the guilty.
Exactly.
And let's not forget the WBSSC's contradictory statements and their attempts to hide information.
Which really didn't help their case.
Not at all.
So basically the court said, we can't trust anything about this selection process. It's all tainted.
Got to start over.
But what about the people who say, hey, I got my job fairly, I didn't cheat, I didn't bribe anyone? How did the Supreme Court address that?
Well, they did acknowledge the difficult situation of those untainted candidates.
The folks who got caught up in this mess.
Right.
Through no fault of their own.
So what did they do for those people?
Well, they upheld the annulment, so all those appointments were canceled.
Even the ones that might have been legitimate.
Yeah, which is tough, I get it.
But they did offer some relief.
Okay, like what?
First of all, they said nobody had to repay their salaries.
Even if their appointment was canceled.
Yeah, the High Court had initially ordered some folks to repay.
But the Supreme Court overturned that.
They did.
That's a big deal.
It is, yeah.
So at least people wouldn't be out of pocket.
Exactly.
What else?
Well, they said that anyone who had previously held a government job and lost it because of this whole mess, they had the right to apply to get their old job back.
And those applications had to be processed quickly?
Within 3 months.
Okay, so there's some attempt to make things right.
Right. Trying to minimize the damage.
And did they keep their seniority and benefits if they got their old job back?
Yes, but they wouldn't get paid for the time they spent in the disputed position.
Yeah. So no double dipping?
Nope.
Okay, makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah, there was a special case.
Oh.
A disabled candidate named Miss Soma Das. The court said she could keep her job.
Even though the whole selection process was invalid?
On humanitarian grounds.
So basically an exception to the rule.
Yeah, and they made it clear this wasn't a precedent.
Not something that everyone could claim.
Right, it was specific to her circumstances.
Okay, and what about other disabled candidates?
They said they could participate in the new selection process with age relaxation and other concessions.
So at least they weren't completely shut out.
Nope, trying to level the playing field as much as possible.
So to sum up, the Supreme Court basically said, look, this whole thing was a disaster. We got to scrap it and start over.
But they tried to soften the blow for the innocent folks.
Right, acknowledging that it's not fair to punish everyone.
Exactly.
So what happens now? What are the next steps?
Well, the WBSSC has to run a whole new selection process.
For all those original vacancies.
Yep, back to square one.
And when is that supposed to happen?
They said it should ideally start after the elections.
Okay, so sometime later this year.
Probably.
And the criminal investigations?
Those are still ongoing.
So people might still face charges even though the selection process has been annulled?
Exactly. The court made it clear that those are separate issues.
Okay, and there's one more thing.
What's that?
Remember those supernumerary posts?
The extra positions they created.
Yeah, the state government's appealing the High Court's order for a CBI investigation into that.
Right.
And the Supreme Court's going to hear that appeal separately.
So more to come on that front.
So it's not completely over yet?
Nope, the saga continues.
So what's the big takeaway here? What's the key message from the Supreme Court?
I think the message is pretty clear. They're not going to tolerate systemic fraud in public recruitment.
Even if it means a lot of people get affected.
Even then.
Because the integrity of the process and public trust are just too important.
Exactly. They're sending a message.
We're serious about this.
Don't even try it.
I think it's interesting that the Supreme Court recognized the human cost here.
They did?
They didn't just say rules are rules, too bad for everyone who got caught up in this.
They tried to find a balance.
Right. They tried to protect the innocent as much as possible.
Which is important.
Because otherwise people might lose faith in the system altogether.
Exactly. You can't just punish everyone indiscriminately.
You have to acknowledge that there are real people with real lives who get affected by these decisions.
Well, sure.
So this whole case really raises a lot of questions.
It does.
About how we ensure fair processes, how we deal with corruption, and how we balance the need for accountability with the rights of individuals.
Big questions, no easy answers.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for helping us unpack all this.
It was my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you want to dive even deeper into this case, we'll put a link to the Supreme Court's full judgment in the show notes. It's civil appeal arising out of SLP, 9586 of 2024. And you can also check out episode 6 of Legal Snippet Law Simplified for their analysis.
They do great work.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.